Well, Coasters, hey, first day of the new year, sun shining, fantastic. Now, for those of you that are interested in the photograph behind me, that's my dad on the over my right shoulder, and I think that's part of why democracy is so important to Coasters and to me and many others in New Zealand. You know, we've got about 30,000 members spread around New Zealand and the world. We send an email out to our database and it's got over 40,000 on it. And we send it out twice a week. We've got many Coasters abroad who have contacted me, and we're looking at the best way to help them. And we feel that the best way is to tell their stories and the stories of other Kiwis who have been denied access to what is their home country. The reality is there's close to 1 million Kiwis living offshore at present. And they don't all want to come home. They just want to live their lives. But they all have a vote. They all have a vote. And the power of 1 million needs to be recognised. The power's with the people. The New Zealand passport was once the passport to hold when you went overseas. It had the right to enter and the right to leave New Zealand. It's, you know, just huge. And it was a fundamental right that was protected under the Bill of Rights. However, this right was taken away by the New Zealand government about 22 months ago now, with using legislation in the name of COVID, name of a health pandemic. Now that at the time, for a month, 2 months, 3 months, hey, we could have lived with. It's now 22 months and it still hasn't been reversed. Entry, of course, to New Zealand can be gained if you know a senior politician, and we've seen many examples of that in recent times with sports people, people who play music, DJs, etc. It's not right. It's democratically not right. So I was approached by a group that's of Kiwis offshore, and they asked me if I was interested in looking at their situation. Now, of course, I am. I've had a lady from Punakaiki in the last 2 days, a family from Atarau. I've had a family from Franz Joseph, and they're all the stories they're telling me. I've had over 40 emails with stories in the last 2 days since I put out the offer. And today, I thought we'd start the process with Justin Walker. And the reason I've selected Justin is that he's a businessman. He's a hero of New Zealand, going out, taking our economy to the world. And he travels everywhere. So, Justin, first of all, absolutely welcome to the Coasters Club show. And
thank you, Bruce.
Yep. It's a real pleasure to have you there, to have you here. Yep. Justin, what's it like being a market leader, a man who has to make his living face to face? Zoom's great, yep, but hey, it's not the same. And I understand you live in Hong Kong.
No, South Korea. So Seoul in South Korea. Yep.
Well, yep. Tell us your story.
So look, thank you, Bruce. Yes, I'm a business entrepreneur. I work for a South Korean medical manufacturing company, and I sell and export their products all around the world. So I'm responsible for the international business of a South Korean company. I'm a Kiwi. I'm a New Zealand taxpayer. I have a wife and a family and a son who live in Hamilton, New Zealand. And prior to the pandemic, I would spend my life in 5-week routines. So I'd spend approximately 2 weeks at home in Hamilton, New Zealand with my family. I would then travel to Korea and spend 2 weeks in my apartment in Yongin and just outside of Seoul in South Korea, and working at my head office, my factory. And then I would spend 1 week in either Europe, North America, or somewhere else in Asia, maybe China, and then return and start the process again for 5 more weeks. So my job is exporting my services, my business entrepreneurship, and I earn money abroad and I bring it back to New Zealand where I pay tax. So that's my life, and it has been this way for about the last 6 years. And it all changed dramatically And around about sort of February, March 2020, with the arrival of it was then called the coronavirus as it was coming in, I was traveling in the Czech Republic at the time. And I returned very quickly to South Korea before things went into full lockdown. And during that time, the New Zealand Ministry of Immigration was sending me messages and emails and suggesting that it was a good time for me to come home to New Zealand before things got too bad. So I returned to New Zealand in March 2020. And interestingly enough, at the time, there was a lot of fear, enormous amount of fear in the community and the global world in travel. It was a very different feeling and situation. But I come from a very unique and lucky perspective. My extended family have a beach house in the Coromandel. So my family decided that because I was coming home and because at that time we didn't have a virus in New Zealand yet, and we didn't yet have managed isolation, my family went through to the beach house. They loaded the fridge up. They put some beers in the fridge for me, made sure there was some sausages and steak and everything else to keep me well accustomed for a few weeks. I returned to Auckland Airport, having traveled business class to keep myself a little bit further away from other passengers. I hopped in my own vehicle at the airport and drove straight to the beach house and self-isolated before isolation was known in New Zealand, to keep my family safe and New Zealand public safe at my beach house, away from everyone. So I arrived into New Zealand, I think it was the 19th of March in 2020. And on Wednesday, the 21st, was when Jacinda Ardern announced that New Zealand was going into lockdown because we had coronavirus in the community. And so I was locked down at the beach. But look, it was good. And I certainly applaud New Zealand for acting fast and acting early. And I think we did really well in the early first few months of 2020, during the beginning of the pandemic. Things were good. They were well managed, and it was a good strategy. But as you said, 22 months later, things are quite different, and it's not right.
How's it impacted on your travel? I mean,
yep. Okay, so look, obviously my job was an enormous amount of travel previously, and my job is still abroad, and I need to be outside of New Zealand to work. So I endured about 3 months in New Zealand during that early period of time in 2020. And at that time, it had been 3 months at home in New Zealand was a lot longer than my usual 2 weeks. And the South Korean company that I work with was scratchy, and they were getting a bit itchy, and they needed me back in Korea. So in June 2020, I elected to leave New Zealand and return to South Korea, because I had to wrap things up and package them and get them prepared and ready for something that was maybe going to be around for a wee bit longer than just a few weeks. It was still a lot of fear. We didn't know what was happening in the community at the time. So I flew from Auckland back to Korea. And upon arrival in South Korea in June 2020, I went into managed isolation by the Korean government. And look, it was very early days in Korea at that stage. They've been running the managed isolation for only a few weeks, but it was really well run. It was incredibly seamless. It was simplistic. I don't speak a lot of Korean, but they explained things to me very plainly, very simply in English. And it was a well-run situation. They had isolation hotels that were a long way away from the general public. They were in isolated little cities outside of Gimpo from the airport. And there was a very low risk. I mean, you were given a room, you were given food, you were given everything you needed for 14 days, but you weren't allowed to mix and mingle. There was no mixing or leaving your room for any circumstances. Health officials came to your room and tested on day 3 and again on day 10. And after 14 days of negative tests, you were released. And in which case you then went through a very careful process to ensure you weren't anywhere near any recent or new arrivals. So it was well managed, it was safe, it was efficient, and it worked. I spent a couple of months in Korea, and I wrapped things up in the business and tried to prepare for the long term of how the pandemic was going to roll out. We were at the time, we sent a couple of container loads of products to Europe and put them into storage in Europe because we didn't know how shipping and other things were going to work. But I needed to be here in Korea with the factory and facilitate that in the middle of 2020. So yeah, it was a different situation, but we were trying to prepare for what was going to happen.
So as we work through 2020,
Yep.
You've done a lot of travel, haven't you?
Yep, of course, yes.
What's the travel like in the rest of the world?
Yep. So interestingly, so a couple of things. Well, 2020 was still a lot of unknown. It was a bit different. So in 2020, after a couple of months in Korea, and finished packaging and wrapping things up and preparing for a long haul, I returned to New Zealand. So I arrived back into New Zealand in August 2020. And went through managed isolation at a hotel in Auckland, in central Auckland, when it was first being run. So it was reasonably good at that time. It was easy. There wasn't any restrictions. There wasn't the lottery to try and come back to New Zealand. There was only a few people trying to come back home, and the New Zealand government was catering and accommodating for pretty much everyone. However, the difference is that there was too much mixing and mingling within the hotels. I mean, I was staying at the Stamford in Auckland City. So they were running managed isolation in our most densely populated city of New Zealand. So if there was going to be a breach, or if there was going to be people jumping the borders and trying to escape and doing other silly things that they were likely be doing at the time, they were going to be mixing and mingling into the most densely populated part of all of New Zealand. And the stupidity behind that was just wrong. I mean, New Zealand in the very early days of COVID should have been setting up managed isolation facilities in Waiouru, in a very isolated, remote part of New Zealand. New Zealand's still got a housing crisis. We're limited, housing capacity. Prices are going through the roof with real estate. You could have built little one-bedroom miniature homes over a vast part of the Waiouru desert and relocated them afterwards as being a cheap and affordable housing. I mean, it would still be cheaper, I'm sure, than what they're doing today. But putting people who are potentially at risk into the centre of New Zealand's most densely populated city is wrong. I mean, Korea wasn't doing it 3 months earlier, and they're still not doing it today. All of the managed isolation facilities in other parts of the world are in isolated locations away from the densely populated areas.
So, Justin, in 2021, when was the last time you come home to see the kids?
That's right. So I returned in 2020, August 2020, and I remained at home in New Zealand for about 11 months. And so I became very accustomed to Zoom conference calling, to Skype calling, and I tried my very best to run a business from Korea, from Hamilton, New Zealand, remotely. And it just got to that point where it was just too difficult. And also I could see things were changing around the rest of the world. I mean, we had a trans-Tasman bubble working for a short period of time. So interestingly enough, in May of 2021, I travelled to Brisbane and spent some time with some friends in Queensland. I conducted some business over there, and then I returned back to New Zealand. Now, at that time, it was green travel. There was no testing. There was no requirements for managed isolation. However, I was coming from Australia, where there was a little bit of COVID in the community, especially in Victoria and New South Wales. And even though I was coming from Queensland, I didn't go home to Hamilton with my family. I went to a hotel in Hamilton City, and I spent 3 days in a hotel in Hamilton City. After 2 days, I went and got tested at the local testing facility for PCR, for COVID. And when I got a negative result, I then went home to my family in Hamilton, because I had a vested interest to keep my wife, my son, my family, and the local community of New Zealand safe. So that's what I did. I went above and beyond what the New Zealand government was telling us to do, and did what we should have been doing at the time. And I feel, I didn't want to be the DJ that was bringing the virus into New Zealand and releasing it to the community and be named as the person that was doing something silly. So we went beyond the measures that were in place to do things right.
So Justin, is this lottery thing working?
No. So interestingly enough is that, so after my trip to Australia, it was an eye-opener. It was interesting to see how they were working the borders between New Zealand and Australia. At the time, you could start buying rapid antigen testing in Australia. So I bought some rapid antigen tests while I was over there, and I was testing. And look, I do applaud the Ministry of Health in New Zealand in early 2020. Early 2020, the rapid antigen testing kits were about, I think, 85% accurate versus the PCR testing, which is about 99% accurate. The vast difference, 14%, was enough to say, let's do PCR and keep people safe. We had an elimination policy in New Zealand at that time, and it was working and it was good. However, during 2020, the testing kits got better. They got safer, they got easier. There was a lot of money spent, especially in South Korea. Some of the local businesses nearby, the companies that I work with, invested millions and millions of dollars into doing testing regimes and policies and procedures that would make the system better. So rapid antigen testing by mid-2021 was almost as accurate. I think these kits here that we get now that are approved by the Ministry of Health in New Zealand are about 98.5% efficient or accurate, as opposed to 99% for PCR. The difference is this test takes 15 minutes and I can do it at home by myself. The kits cost me 6,000 won for a 2-test kit. 6,000 won is around about $6 New Zealand. So each test is $3. And at 15-minute results and almost the same accuracy as PCR. So I perform these tests, or our factory staff perform them weekly. Every week, Monday morning, everybody gets tested when they arrive at the factory, where at our offices. And then we do temperature testing daily of all staff. And interestingly enough is that when you're traveling around Korea and around the rest of the world, like even when I was in Europe, I was in Germany in November 2021. I was in Germany and Netherlands and the UK. We have scanned barcodes for entry to all shops, all cafes, or restaurants to prove that you're vaccinated, and they're testing temperatures at all locations. I don't know how much temperature testing we're doing in New Zealand at all, because the very first symptoms, although we have symptoms of COVID, the very first indicator of COVID is an elevated temperature.
I've never struck it.
No, there you go. So interesting. Look at even in the media, like last year in 2021, I was watching the pandemic as it unfolded in Fiji, and I saw one of the best things that you could see. You could see that it was really imploding in Fiji, and Fiji was really struggling with a massive, crisis with the pandemic rolling out. One of the great things that I could see very early on in the media they did in Fiji was they set up screening centres outside of the main hospital. So everybody arriving at the hospital was screened for COVID by temperature testing before entering the hospital. Look at New Zealand, even in the the August pandemic in Auckland, we're still not screening at emergency centres, doctors' facilities, pharmacies, or anywhere. You could walk into Auckland Hospital for a common cold or for a cough or a flu or a cut on the hand or anything, and you could be carrier of the virus, and you're walking into a building with an air conditioning system that's going to spread the virus throughout the entire hospital with vulnerable people in oncology departments that would be suffering immediately. So setting up the screening process at the front door on the outside of the hospital in the car park before entering the building was absolutely paramount to what helped Fiji overcome a massive crisis.
Well, I guess the thing that's coming through loud and clear from the emails I've gotten the last couple of days are the extraordinary circumstances of people disconnected from their families, people who have someone died, need to get home. What's the answer?
So in June of last year, 2021, I returned to Korea. At that time, I logged into the managed isolation facility from Hamilton, New Zealand, and I could easily book a spot for July, August. It was reasonably easy. There was plenty of vacancy, and I didn't have any problems. So I figured, well, look, no problems at all. I'm going to return to Korea. I don't want to come back to Hamilton in July. I'm going to stay in Korea for 3 or 4 months, and I'll return October, November, and come home for the New Zealand summer. So I left New Zealand, I arrived in Korea, went through the managed isolation, and then New Zealand had our border break, and we had the lockdown in Auckland in August, and managed isolation was shut down for a period of, I think it was about 6 weeks, where nobody could book a spot. We were locked out 100% for 6 weeks. It was impossible to get anything in New Zealand. During that time, they then looked at some of the criticism about the way the system, you had to log in and get, and if you weren't at the beginning of the queue, then you'd miss out. So they created this lobby system. And with the lobby, it meant that you log in for 1 hour duration before the release, and you get randomly located or selected in a location. So when this process started, I was logging in every time there was a release because I wanted to be coming home. And look, it was just soul destroying. I mean, New Zealand, the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Innovation and Business would release and say, look, we're going to have a release on Wednesday of next week. So on Wednesday, they would say the release would happen at 9 a.m. New Zealand time, and the lobby would open at 8 a.m. Well, 8 a.m. New Zealand time is 4 a.m. in Korea. So I would have to get up well, theoretically, you would get up at 3:50 a.m. in the morning, and you would log into your computer, you would enter your passport details and go through the authentication process. And then you would enter a lobby where 1 hour later, there would be a random draw, and then you would be selected as to whether or not you may or may not get a selection to come home and have the opportunity to book a room. Now, it's easy to say 9 a.m. is the selection process and you start logging in from 8 a.m. New Zealand time, but 4 a.m. in Korea. And the process at that stage, we didn't know how it was working. I start work in Korea at about 7:30 a.m. And so I was thinking to myself, look, do I stay at home in my apartment and log in? And do I wait for the process to end and then go to the office? So the first time I did this, that's exactly what I did. I logged in at home. So I got up 10 minutes before and I logged in at 4 o'clock in the morning and waited an hour, and then saw that I was 27,000 in the queue and that I was unlikely to get a room. But I wanted to see the process. I wanted to see if that 27,000 would reduce, would it increase, would it change, what was happening? So I stayed logged into the computer for about 4 hours. The process, that's how long it took. And so I was unable to work. I was stuck at home. I couldn't shut the computer down because look, nobody knew. There was no instruction manual as to how the system was working, and the online community was telling us what we should and shouldn't be doing. And the key thing was that I didn't want to close the internet or shut the computer down or move to my mobile through fear that you would lose the connection altogether. Oh, so I was stuck, isolated at home for 5 hours of the day, and arrived at the office an hour, 4 hours late. And so the next time that we had a release, I decided, well, look, bugger that. I'll get up earlier. I'll shower, I'll dress, I'll have breakfast. I'll travel to the office and I'll log in at the office. So instead, I get up at 2:30 in the morning. I prepare myself for work. I commute to work. I log into my office computer at 4 a.m. in the morning and wait. So look, I went through the process, 7 attempts. I think I was 27,000, I was 32,000, 17,000. The best I got down to was about 9,000 in the queue at one stage for a lottery. I'm a New Zealander, I'm a taxpayer, I have a New Zealand passport. I was at that time an illegal migrant. I'm only allowed in Korea for 90 days before I have to travel outside and come back. And I was isolated. I couldn't come home, and my New Zealand government wasn't allowing me in.
It's absolutely wrong. Yep. Justin, would you mind if we continue this conversation?
Sure.
Look, I'd like to get in touch with you. There's a number of questions that have come out of some of the things you're telling us. But yep, for the time being, look, I really want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I will reconnect with you because, as I say, I've got a number of questions. And thank you so much for joining us. What an interesting life.
Thank you, Bruce. And look, I was going to say, I kind of thank the New Zealand government for early 2020. I think there was good measures put in place in the very early days of the pandemic. However, by mid-2020, things were wrong. There was no plan for the long term, and there was no plan for how things are going to change in the future. I mean, nearly half of New Zealand's GDP previously was tourism. We've had the borders closed for 22 months now. We're still not allowing people back in, not allowing residents back in, let alone our tourists back in. And I think things need to change. And the rest of the world is accommodated. Look, Incheon Airport, when I travelled in November, has set up testing facilities at the airport. You log in, you book, you pay for a test 1 hour before you check in, and you get a result and then go to check in. And these facilities are not temporary structures that will be pulled down in 3 months' time. These are permanent structures, whether it's COVID, whether it's SARS virus, whether it's bird flu at some stage in the future, there will always be something we're having to manage. We have to learn to manage it and plan it for the long term in a proper way that's going to work.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for taking the time. I will be back in touch. On behalf of all of those people that are grounded offshore, thank you for coming forward and starting this conversation. And you'll see an interview probably every day now for the next 30, 40, 50 days. And
thank you.
You've certainly kicked the ball off. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Look, thank you, Bruce, and look, thank you to all the people of New Zealand for listening to our stories. And look, and please allow us home at some stage. We want to be able to come home.
Look, trust me, we care. We do care.
Yep.
Well, wasn't that interesting? Justin Walker, out there earning for our country, building a future for his wife and child, a New Zealander with a New Zealand passport and a New Zealand taxpayer. We will reconnect with him. Now, he's only shared a small part of his story with us. Up until the last couple of days, I had not considered the impact on the thousands of New Zealanders who hold a New Zealand passport, pay tax in New Zealand, and who can't return to New Zealand. So their jobs are placed on hold. Their ability to earn for the country is placed on hold. And the hardships that I've seen in the emails coming in make me very sad. I can't believe we've turned into such an uncaring country. There's 1 million Kiwis offshore. 1 million. There's about 30,000 want to come home. All sorts of reasons. Look, the emails I'm getting from pensioners who've gone to visit family, who are jammed in Australia. They can't come back because they've been out of the country more than 6 months. Their pension's been stopped. People's tax status has been changed because they've become an offshore resident. We have Kiwis who have become overstayers in countries around the world, breaking the law because of the draconian legislation that was put in place by the current government. Hey, it was all right for the first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, but 22 months later, it's actually not all right. You know, many of the emails that I've had in are from people who are feeling helpless. They feel that we don't care as a community and as New Zealanders. And that's simply not true. You know, there's 1 million of them. I don't know how many of them have the ability to vote, but they're a powerful, powerful voting bloc. They need to get their act together. If I can assist in any way, I'm going to, because this type of situation where the most valuable passport in the world suddenly worth nothing has to cease. If you're one of those people out there, email me on a real coaster at extra.co.nz. I'm Bruce Smith, the Western District Mayor, and you're going to hear a lot more from us on this matter. And for those people who have contacted me from Punakaiki, South Westland, Atarau, the Grey Valley, I'll be in touch. Let's get your story and let's get it out there, because it's just so important. And we'll catch you later.